Hi all, it's Whitney Kurtz Ogilvy, your academic writing specialist, and today I'm going to talk to you about how to write a strong abstract. So what is an abstract and what is it for? Well, if you have ever done a literature search, which I'm sure most of you have, did you read every single article that popped up when you put in your search terms? Probably not, right? You skimmed abstracts, and that was how you determined which articles, if any, were relevant to your topic of interest. You might have also read through abstracts just to keep abreast of the most current research. You guys are busy professionals, so you don't necessarily have time to read every article that's published in your field. So abstracts can be a great way to help people like you to keep current on what's going on in your specialty. So those are really the two main purposes for abstracts. Sometimes they're also used by conference organizers to determine which presentations might be relevant. So sometimes you'll submit an abstract to a conference to try and do a poster presentation or a podium presentation. So those are really the main purposes of an abstract. And in a nutshell, what an abstract does is, first of all, it provides a first impression of your paper or presentation, which is, as we all know, really important. But also, it is a concise summary of what the paper or presentation will cover. And that's very useful, again, because it helps other scholars or other professionals to determine whether they want to read that article. Now, first and foremost, it is important to remember that an abstract has to stand alone. It's not an introduction to the paper. It is a standalone document. So it has to make sense on its own. So let's talk about some tips for strong abstracts. An abstract should be brief. And most of the time that means between 150 and 250 words. Now, there is some wiggle room with that sometimes. You should always check your author guidelines if you're submitting to a conference or to a journal, and they will tell you, how long your abstract should be, and it should not be one word longer, because that's the easiest way to get rejected, is to not follow those author guidelines. So briefness is important. And that means, again, that you're only going to be able to cover the most important information. You're not going to include a lot of detail. You're not going to add to or comment on anything in the paper. It's just a preview. And that leads me to my second point, which is that abstracts should be concise, focusing on main ideas only. If you were going to ride up in an elevator with me, and you had from floor 1 to floor 10 to describe to me your paper or presentation, what would you say? And that's when I say bullet points, that's what I mean. It's the broad strokes, it's the main ideas. Conciseness is key. An abstract should also be accurate and specific, meaning there shouldn't be anything in the abstract that doesn't get fulfilled in the paper, and there shouldn't be anything really important in the paper that isn't previewed in the abstract. Specificity means that there's no ambiguity or doubt about what that paper is going to cover. If the paper takes a stance or makes a recommendation, that should be included in the abstract as well. No doubts, no surprises. Okay, moving on. An abstract should also be clear and readable. So what does that mean? It means, first of all, focus on clear, straightforward language. Don't try to get fancy, don't try to get flowery. One thing that I think most journal editors will agree on is that they hate when people try to sound like Shakespeare. They hate overly flowery, overly complicated sentence structure. That may surprise some people because they think academic writing should sound sort of fancy, but really it shouldn't. The best writing is clear, simple, and straightforward. Just say what you're trying to say as simply as you can. Readable means that it is free of grammar errors, it's free of punctuation errors, it is free of anything that would interfere with readability, with picking up what you're putting down. So how do you ensure that your paper is readable? Well, you can obviously proofread it yourself. You should make use of your computer spell checker and grammar checker, but those things are not foolproof. So always proofread yourself, and the best way by far to do that is to read it out loud. It's going to slow you down, and it's going to make sure that you actually hear your sentence structure and not just get the gist as you skim over it silently. Read it out loud, and in addition to that, get somebody else to do it. Get somebody else to cast an eye over it for you. That might be a professor, a friend, a mentor, or perhaps your writing specialist. That's what I'm here for, right? All right, next on the list of characteristics of a strong abstract, if I can get my paper here, things to avoid. You want to avoid abbreviations, and jargon. So there are some exceptions to the abbreviations rule. Everybody knows, for example, what DNA is. Everybody knows, for example, what HIV stands for. And everybody knows that US stands for United States. So there are some exceptions to that. If, you would know it if you weren't living under a rock, then it's fine to go ahead and use it. But beyond that, you want to avoid abbreviations because some people might not know what they stand for and you don't want to alienate anybody or confuse anybody. Jargon means overly technical language, overly specialty specific language. You may be intending that your paper is read mostly by people in your specialty, but that doesn't mean that it might not benefit somebody in another specialty. And within nursing, there are a lot of specialties, and even among nurses, you all had the same basic training, but then you branched off into different specialties. I can think of many instances where a paper in one specialty might benefit a nurse in another specialty. But if there's all kinds of jargon and technical language and specialty-specific language in the abstract, it might send them away because they're, convinced that they wouldn't understand it. So if you absolutely must use technical terms, if you absolutely must use jargon, include a brief definition, but generally it's best to avoid it. All right, in the abstract. In the paper, you can define those terms, obviously. More things to avoid in an abstract. This one surprises people, but you want to avoid references. You're not going to cite sources in an abstract, and here's why, okay? The purpose of an in-text citation is to correspond to a references list citation, so that if you're reading through the paper and the author mentions a statistic or, piece of information that you find interesting, and you want to read more about that, then that in-text citation is going to tell you where to go in the references list to get the full citation, the full reference, and that way you can go and find that source and read it and get more information. In an abstract, remember, an abstract stands alone. So an abstract doesn't have a references list. It doesn't have that. So there's nothing to check that reference against, and therefore no point in including an in-text citation. And in an abstract, you shouldn't really need very often to cite sources and bring in all that kind of detail because you're just really focusing on a preview of what your paper is going to cover, what your presentation is going to cover. So it's not usually necessary to bring in a lot of source information. If it is, then you can include, the author's name or the name of the organization. According to this, in 2012, the CDC released a report that said blank, or whatever. A researcher named Jones did a study in 2012 that showed blank, and then you don't have to worry about that little parenthetical citation. All right. You also want to avoid referring to anything in the paper, such as a chart or a table, a figure, that your reader is not going to have access to without having the manuscript itself in front of them. So remember, the abstract is a standalone document. They're not going to have access to a table that's part of the paper. They're not going to have that. So if you refer to it in the abstract, it's just going to confuse people. So avoid that. Another tip. Take some time, take a sentence or two to address the implications of what you discussed in your paper. Implications meaning the so what question. Why is this important? Why should we care? Why should I read this paper, right? So you want to address that because, again, the abstract is the first impression. That's the hook. That's what gets people interested in reading your full article, or if it's a conference proposal abstract, that's what's going to get those conference organizers to accept you for your presentation. So addressing the implications is the hook. That's how you convince readers that what you've written about is important and that they should care about it. So now that we have all this information, what do we do with it? Why is it important? Etc. So that's what I mean by implications. All right, let me just check my notes here. A couple more tips. All right, APA, now this is APA specific. I don't know what other handbooks have to say about it, but APA says not to repeat the title in the abstract. It's just not necessary to do that and just takes up space. It's also important to know that some journals require what we call a structured abstract. A lot of times an abstract is just a paragraph, it's just a block of text, but some journals require a structured abstract, and I'm sure you've seen them. Structured abstract is an abstract that has headings, so it might say, background, methods, results, etc. And just make sure that you check your author guidelines when you're submitting either to a journal or to a conference and see whether they want a structured or an unstructured abstract. And definitely always follow your author guidelines. So that's it for me. There's more information about this. There's a PowerPoint presentation that goes into some of this in more detail on the Canvas Writing Resources page. So if you're a University of Kentucky College of Nursing student, or if you're a UK healthcare nurse, you can access that. And it also has some sample abstracts that will illustrate some of these things that we've talked about. And as always, don't hesitate, if you're one of my students, to give me a call or an email and set up an appointment if you need help. Have a great day. Bye-bye.